this is going to be part 6 of our lectures on corporate social responsibility, and in today's lecture of mine I shall be telling you about the impact assessment and what are the penal provisions into this enactment, which is very much known as Section 135 of Companies Act 2013. So I'll be telling you about what is the time frame, scope and approach of impact assessment, what are the penal provisions, because earlier there was no penal provision. It was only a matter of comply or explain, whether if you are able to spend 2% of your profit on listed CSR activities, it is okay, and if you are not able to, then you have to only explain that yes, this much of money is not spent. So earlier there were no penal provisions, but now we have some penal provisions also, and there are two categories of those penal provisions. One deals with the companies, that companies, if they are not able to comply with these provisions, there are certain penal provisions, and along with this penal provision for companies, we have certain provisions for officers in default as well. So with this agenda, I'll be telling you in today's lecture of mine what is impact assessment, what are the independent, what kind of agencies are doing that, and what is their scope, what is their time frame and scope while performing this kind of activity, and eventually we'll talk about the penal provisions. So let us start our discussion with the topic of impact assessment. So if we talk about Rule 8 subsection 3, it brings in the requirement of impact assessment. It says that you have to conduct an impact assessment of your CSR activity, whatever policy the company has formulated and implemented. You have to actually look into the impactfulness of this particular activity. You have to assess, you have to conduct a kind of assessment whether your entire procedure was impactful or not, or whether you could achieve what you wanted to achieve or not. So but there are certain conditions into that. Not every company is supposed to conduct this kind of assessment, but yes, of course there are certain categories where companies are supposed to conduct this kind of impact assessment. If your CSR target in each of 3 preceding financial years is rupees 10 crore or more, suppose if we talk about your CSR target and in last 3 preceding financial years your amount is rupees 10 crore or more, if it exceeds, either it is 10 crore or more than that, or the activity or the project having an outlay of rupees 1 crore or more, if these 2 conditions are fulfilled, or if any of these 2 conditions are fulfilled, then of course you are supposed to conduct an impact assessment of your CSR policy, of your CSR activity. And when this enactment, this provision came, it actually became applicable to projects completed on or after 22nd of January 2021. So any project which completed on or after 22nd of January 2021, for them it was applicable, and since the requirement was applicable or implemented with immediate effect, so the CSR target for financial year 17-18, 18-19 and 19-20 becomes relevant to see the impact assessment which is required for the financial year 2020-21. So it came in the year in the month of January 2021, and of course it belonged to the financial year of 2021, and since the effectiveness started from the same financial year, so previous 3 years became applicable for the companies, and impact assessment is supposed to be carried out by an independent agency. The agency which is conducting this kind of assessment is supposed to be independent. Independent, when we say, it means that they should not have any vested interest into the company or into any of those activities. They should be neutral people or agency which has nothing to do with your CSR activity or your company's operations, so that they can give a kind of unbiased report, or they can conduct a genuine assessment of your impactfulness, whether your activity, whether the CSR policy of company which you made, which you have drafted or created or made, whether it was implemented in its letters and spirit or not. That is what we expect in this kind of assessment. So when we talk about impact assessment, basically the purpose of impact assessment is to assess the social impact. What is the social impact of your particular CSR activity, and hence it is also called as social impact assessment. Some of the companies, they call it as social impactfulness. of our CSR activities. Because of course, when they talk about corporate social responsibility, they are dealing with certain social responsibilities, and here we talk about the social impact assessment of this particular policy, which you have drafted, which you have framed and implemented in your company with the help of your CSR committee. And impact assessment may also include social return on investment, that whatever investment you have made, what is the return on that. So since it is not your ROI, because your objective is not to make any profit, you cannot call it ROI, return on investment. So to justify that, yes, we are basically working for the betterment of our society and we are spending on listed CSR activities. So there is a prefix of social in your ROI, that we'll conduct a kind of assessment which can tell us, which can give us an idea of the social ROI, what is my social return on investment which my company has made. And it is, I personally feel that it is needed also, because there is an enactment that you have to spend 2% of your profit amount you have spent. But if you don't look back and see that whether the expenditure which you have incurred was impactful or not, whether it could cause some impact, some positive impact or not, there is no point simply spending and putting it on records. Because if you really want to do something for the society, then of course you have to conduct this kind of assessment on a regular basis, and there you can find out what is my social ROI. So when we have to define this very term of impact assessment, our objective is to understand that my motive is to basically assess the social impact of my particular CSR policy or expenditure which I have made. So, but here is a question in front of all the learners or even the CSR practitioners: what is meant by independent impact assessment agency? And here they look, they basically expect some answer from the enactment, that what is there into the CSR Companies Act 2013. So as far as this definition of independent impact assessment agency is concerned, the eligibility criteria is left upon the board's discretion. It is basically left to the discretion of the board of directors, that let them decide that whether the agency which they are hiring for this specific work of impact assessment, whether it is independent or not. It is the onus is on those directors on that board to ensure that the agency which is given this specific, which is given this task of conducting impact assessment, they should ensure that they are the independent one and they are completing, performing or executing their activities independently. They should not be dependent on any of the officers or any of the KMPs operating in the company. Now there are certain key questions related to impact assessment when we talk about the impact assessment of CSR activities. The first very question which comes to us is, to whom this impact assessment report is addressed, to whom to report? And of course the answer is that it should be addressed to the board of directors, because they are the appointing authority, and this has to be placed before the board. If we look at the Rule 8 subsection 3 part B of Companies Act 2013, it clearly mentions that it has to be placed before the board, and it also forms part of your CSR annual report. While giving the annual report of the CSR activity in the annual report of the company is supposed to give a complete mention of it, that what is the outcome of impact assessment, which agency has performed this activity, what all parameters on which they have conducted this kind of assessment, what is the social ROI, everything they are supposed to write in their CSR report, which is supposed to be included in the annual report of the company. Now the second question comes is, will impact assessment to be done for projects completed by 2019-20, because the rule came in the year 2020-21. So here is a question that whether companies which are fulfilling or completing those conditions, are they also supposed to report, are they also supposed to conduct the impact assessment? Answer is, if we talk about the mandate, it is not mandatory by the act, because the rule came in the year 2020-21, in the financial year 2021. So it cannot be applicable from retrospectively. You cannot say that it is supposed to be implemented for the year 2019-20. But yes, of course, if we ask the regulators, they would say that companies can do it as a part of their good practices or best practices, what you call. It can be done by them as a part of their best practices, but it is not mandatory. And the purpose of this entire impact assessment is to conduct this social assessment of social impactfulness of this activity, and we compute social ROI into that. And social impact assessment and social audit, they are closely related. When we say social audit, of course it is a kind of social audit where you have to find the impactfulness of your activities which are targeted towards the betterment of our society. Wherever you have partnered with the government agencies, wherever you have worked under PPP model, that is public private partnership model, there also, suppose if your company is basically, it has entered into an agreement under PPP model, that is public private partnership model, for the welfare of the society, there also you have to conduct this social audit, and you can compute that to what extent your efforts were impactful, and if they were not impactful, you can take corrective steps. Whatever suggestions that agency is giving, you can basically incorporate those changes, and you can improvise upon your CSR policy or whatever activity you are performing under the CSR policy of your company, for which you are interested with. You are given the responsibility to spend 2% of your profit on CSR, and then of course after conducting impact assessment, you come to know that here is the flaw. Now this impact assessment is, if you ask me what kind of companies are working this, based on my experience, and when I look into, since it is too early to comment that what are the different types of companies, but yes, of course, on the basis of the available data, we can say that mostly academic or research entities with the capabilities of field surveys, understanding the objectives of the CSR interventions, they are conducting this kind of impact assessment, because they are supposed to be the independent one. It is just like having independent directors from academia into the board of a company, and you will find that most of the professors, eminent personalities from B schools or from leading universities, they are basically joining the board as independent director. Likewise here also, those academic or research entities with the capabilities of conducting field surveys, because of course unless you go to the ground and collect the data and find out whether the impact, whether the plan which you have crafted or drafted in the air conditioned room of your office, whether it could reach to the needy people or not, whether the beneficiary could get the benefit of this entire plan or not. That is what is the motive, and for that only we conduct this impact assessment. So only those entities can perform this activity which are equipped with the facilities of capabilities of conducting field surveys, understanding the objectives of CSR interventions and all. And of course we have to report it to board of directors. Now again another question comes, is it a regular feature for the company? Then of course if the same project or similar activity is recurring in nature, it seems that impact assessment may be carried out once. Hence ideally impact assessment may be carried out on a rotational basis, so as to cover all material projects. Say once in 3 years you have to of course conduct this kind of assessment. It should not be, you cannot say that it should be on daily basis, then but of course whenever you are finding out the time frame, you have to actually conduct that impact assessment on rotational basis. Suppose there is a time frame of 3 years and your project is lasting for 3 years, so you can start after 6 months of the completion of the project. During that process you can find out in the mid of the project and at the end of the project. So once in 3 years at least it should be the minimum point where you should at least conduct that impact assessment. Now, while conducting this kind of impact assessment, you have to be very cautious, you have to be very vigilant that it should not be confined to merely a paperwork. You should not take it as a formality, you should not take it as an obligation that you are conducting this kind of impact assessment. There is an agency which you have hired and you have got a certificate from that. So, it should not be reduced to merely getting a certification from some agency. It should be done with this motive that I am spending some money, whether I could get the benefit of that money, that expenditure or not. It is just like me spending some money for my hard-earned money for some betterment, some better work. So whether that work is done or not, I always ensure. Likewise, we should take the similar kind of care and concern for these CSR activities whenever we are working in a CSR committee or in a CSR board, or we are forming the part of board of directors. So objective of this impact assessment is, you must have seen that there is a condition of that amount. If it is sizable, if your expenditure is sizable, then of course you have to conduct the impact assessment. Otherwise your hard-earned money of the company will go haywire, and the society will not get benefit, and you will also not be able to achieve what you wanted to achieve by the way of this CSR policy of your company. Now with this we have understood what is impact assessment all about, what type of agencies are performing, which type of companies are supposed to conduct this kind of analysis, and what is the benefit of it. What is the benefit of it, to whom the report is addressed, and where the report finds place. I have tried to answer to all those questions that it is supposed to be reported in the annual report of your companies. Now coming to the second segment of this very lecture, that is, what are the penal provisions under CSR provisions, what are the penal implications under CSR provisions. When we talk about the penalties which are being imposed, which are being stipulated under the CSR provisions, we are reminded of section 135 subsection 7, especially which is related to section 135 subsection 5 and 6, which means that penalty mentioned in section 135 subsection 7 is payable only for if your company, for two conditions. One, when your company fails to spend the target CSR amount. Suppose your company is falling under the purview of a company which is supposed to spend 2% of their profit on listed CSR activity, and your company could not comply with those provisions, and you fail to spend the target CSR amount. So this is the first condition. Or second condition is, suppose if you fail to do so, you are supposed to transfer the remaining money to unspent CSR account, or you have to make payment to some listed activity as per the provisions. You can transfer to certain government recognized funds also if you are not able to spend. So either you have spent that money, and or if you could not spend, you have transferred it to requisite unspent CSR account or the indicated account. Then in that case the penalty clause is not applicable to you, does not apply to you. But in case you fail to spend the target amount, and eventually after doing so you are not able to transfer the money to unspent CSR account, it means section 135 subsection 7 is applicable to you, and you are supposed to pay that penalty. You are basically, since you are not complying with the provisions mentioned in section 135 of Companies Act 2013, so of course you have to pay that penalty. And that penalty, if you talk about penalty, that penal provision includes two important aspects. One is penalty on company, another is penalty on officers in default. Now let us talk about penalty on company as an entity. Suppose if you could not spend the target amount on listed CSR activity, and eventually at the end of the financial year you could not even transfer that remaining amount in an account called unspent CSR account. In that case, your penalty will be up to twice the amount required to be transferred to funds specified in Schedule 7 or unspent CSR account. So whatever amount you could not transfer, twice that amount will become the amount of penalty, or rupees 1 crore, whichever is lower. Here the enactment is slightly having a lighter hand on the company. They are not saying that the highest of these two, because normally whenever there is a penalty clause, you will find that highest of the two important values is basically taken. But here, since it is concerned with the CSR activity of the company, it is related to CSR activities of a company, and you are working for the welfare of the society, then of course government is also having a considerate behavior in terms of this these legal provisions also. They consider it to be a kind of default which should not be taken brutally. They are also having a lighter hand, that up to twice the amount required to be transferred to funds specified in Schedule 7 or unspent CSR account, or rupees 1 crore, whichever is lower. So suppose if your company could not spend 50 lakh rupees, 60 lakh rupees out of their target CSR expenditure, so as per the Companies Act section 135 subsection 7, your penalty becomes twice this amount. 60 lakh becomes 1 crore 20 lakh, and the second amount is rupees 1 crore. So whichever is less means 1 crore will be your penalty as a company. So company will be basically charged with this much of money on account of non-compliance with the provisions of CSR, that is section 135. Now coming to the penalty on officers in default, it is basically 1/10 of amount required to be transferred to fund specified in Schedule 7 or unspent CSR account, or rupees 2 lakh, whichever is lower. So for those officers who are basically in charge of performing the CSR activity, for them it is 1/10 of amount required to be transferred. Like in the previous example of company, I told you that 60 lakh rupees you are supposed to transfer. So here in this case, 1/10 of 60 lakh will be 10%, that is 6 lakh rupees, or rupees 2 lakh, whichever is lower, is supposed to be paid by those officers who are basically in charge of this activity, and they have defaulted, so they are supposed to pay this much of penalty on account of non-compliance. So it is the penalty is having the implication at two ends. One is on account of company, that company is supposed to pay, and even the individually the person is responsible, So in order to ensure the accountability, this provision has been included in the Companies Act 2013 section 135 subsection 7. So this is about the penal provisions which is implemented, and now it is no more comply or explain kind of affair. You have to pay certain amount of penalty if you are not complying with the requisite provisions. The objective is to ensure that the companies are taking it seriously, and even the officers who are entrusted with the responsibility of this CSR expenditure, they should also take it seriously. Otherwise it can also become a burden on their pocket, that they will have to pay it from their own pocket. So it will become a personal liability of those officers also. Given this implementation of this provision, they have to be a little careful that if we don't do so, not only company, even the officers in default, they will have to pay the cost of this non-compliance. Now for the mandatory provisions of section 135 or CSR policy rules, there is no specific penalty provisions. Section 450 applies where there is no specific penalty, and if there is no specific penalty, it is rupees 10,000 plus rupees 1,000 per day, subject to maximum of rupees 2 lakh on the company and rupees 50,000 on officers in default. This is basically for the mandatory provisions of section 135 or the CSR policy rules. There is no specific penalty provisions, because that specific penalty provision was for either not spending the target money, or if you are not able to pay, to spend that amount of that target amount, you have to transfer it to the unspent CSR account. If you could not do that, then in that case company as well as the officer in default will be liable to pay that money. Otherwise the penalty section 450 applies where there is no specific penalty. It says that it should be 10,000 rupees plus rupees 1,000 per day, but there is a maximum limit, there is a rider to it, 2 lakh rupees on the company and 50,000 rupees on officers in default. Now let us summarize the entire process of CSR spending, because we have been having a long discussion on CSR provisions, their composition, what kind of activities which are listed under Schedule 7, and how to calculate the 2% of the profit, what are the penal provisions, what is CSR committee, what is the composition of that, what basically we mean by CSR policy, and in what manner CSR is implemented. So it's time for us to summarize the entire process of CSR spending, the way it starts and where it concludes with the impact assessment. So first of all, what we do is, there is a CSR committee in company, and it is supposed to, after formulating the policy and everything, they are supposed to review the expenditure of previous year, and they have to find out if there is any unspent amount to be reported. So this CSR committee is supposed to find out that they have to review the entire expenditure in the previous year, and they have to find is there any unspent amount which is supposed to be reported. If it is there, of course they would ensure that it is transferred to unspent CSR account or to the or it is paid to the listed funds where the government has stipulated that you can, if you are not able to spend, you can transfer that money to those indicated or stipulated funds which are being managed and governed by the Government of India. After this the second step is the committee shall discuss and determine the focus area of CSR spending for the current financial year as per the CSR policy, that what will be our focus area, where we are supposed to focus, and to what extent we have to determine the focus area of our CSR spending for the current financial year as per the CSR policy. And then of course the third level is that the committee shall decide whether CSR project shall be undertaken by the company itself, or we are going to hire some implementing agency, or we are going to implement it via some other agencies which are given this responsibility. After deciding that either I will do as a company or some agencies are hired, the amount remaining unspent as at the end of the financial year is supposed to be transferred within the stipulated timeline. The reason is very clear. I told you, if you are not able to spend, you have to transfer it to the unspent CSR account. If you fail to do so, there are penal provisions not only applicable for company but also for the officers in default. And then afterwards what happens, the CSR team shall initiate the activities, and board shall take note of minutes of CSR committee and discuss if any unspent amount is to be disclosed in the board's report. So they have to report it in the board's report also, and the CSR committee shall obtain utilization certificate from the implementation agency. If we have hired some implementation agency, we have to take UC from them, that is called utilization certificate, so that it can be submitted to the auditor. And while conducting the audit, auditor should also understand that this much of money is spent. And if company itself is doing, then of course their own concurrent auditor will do that audit of that money which is spent on that, and company shall undertake the impact assessment and monitoring of activities undertaken. If they are coming and they fulfill those conditions of sizable amount which is being spent on CSR. Otherwise also, as a part of their best practices, companies can do. So it starts from formulation of CSR policy, that is formulating CSR policy, and it ends with the impact assessment and monitoring of activities undertaken. So it is a huge task which is being given to the companies, and of course companies are doing it, doing their best, trying their level best to give the best results. And they are not finding it as a burdensome job. They are now finding it as a part of their CSR activity. Earlier they were spending in a different manner. There were some voluntary guidelines, they were spending as per that. But now, since there are certain mandates, it is quite easy for them also. They are finding it quite planned and quite systematic while planning and executing these CSR activities. So with this, I am ending today's lecture of mine. I hope you must have understood all the important components of CSR provisions which is being laid down under the Companies Act 2013. I hope you must have understood and enjoyed today's lecture of mine. Thank you so much.